As the church year nears its end, our scripture readings continue to draw us into the language of the end times. Today's gospel picks up where we left off last week, with Jesus on the Mount of Olives, just after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. He's with a small group, just his closest friends, before he will be arrested and condemned to death. We might imagine for just a moment what this time must have been like for Jesus, sensing the impending danger, anticipating the grief of leaving his friends, perhaps overcome with urgency that they really get who he truly is and what he's all about. And in this crucial moment, there are no speeches, no directives, no commandments, just parables, little stories with simple imagery but packed with layers of meaning. The parable we heard today is one of three that Jesus tells in the 25th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. The one we heard last week began like this: "The kingdom of heaven will be like bridesmaids waiting with lamps to walk in with the groom." And next week, we'll hear, "When the Son of Man comes in his glory, he will be like a shepherd king who places the sheep on his right and the goats on his left." This week's parable begins simply, "For it is as if a man going on a journey entrusted his property to three of his slaves. To one he gave 5 talents, to another 2, and to another just 1. We know how this story goes. When the master returns, he is delighted to find that the first 2 slaves have doubled their talents, but dismayed and angered to learn that the 3rd slave has not. He promotes the first 2 and casts out the 3rd. Taken at face value, the moral of the story is simple enough. We should work hard to increase our wealth. This idea is at the heart of the Protestant work ethic and various strands of prosperity theology, which would tell us that when God is pleased with us, we will be rewarded with material wealth. Or, taken at another, perhaps more spiritual level, we might understand talents to mean innate gifts or abilities. And in this scenario, it's less about increasing our financial wealth and more about developing and multiplying our own inner gifts in order to please God. The moral of the story here: don't hide your light under a bushel. Now, let me pause for a moment here to say that if you've already heard something that you need to hear today, and if the Spirit is nudging you somehow to work harder or to develop your gifts, then by all means, please spend some time there, and you can disregard the rest of this. But I have to admit that these usual interpretations leave me wondering if maybe we need to dig a little deeper to work out what Jesus might have meant in his time and his place. It might help us to consider, what's a talent? It's a unit of weight used in the ancient world. In Jesus' time, it was a unit of currency equal to about 6,000 denarii. Even a single talent was a massive sum, equal to roughly 20 years of wages for the average worker. Interestingly, the English word talent, as we know it, evolved from the Greek and Latin through Old English based on this very parable to mean one's innate skills or abilities. So since this is a later linguistic development, I think it makes it less likely that that's what Jesus meant. And I think we have to take a closer look at the master. What do we really know about him? We know that he's extremely wealthy at the start of the story. The 8 talents he distributed represent 160 years worth of wages. And by the end of the story, he's accumulated nearly 300 years' worth. We know that he didn't come by this money fairly. At that time, it would have been impossible to achieve that kind of return on investment without engaging in predatory lending practices, which the Torah expressly forbids. We also know that this master is ruthless. According to the third slave, he is a harsh man who reaps where he did not sow and gathers where he did not scatter. The word used here for harsh is the same word used in the book of Exodus to describe the Pharaoh's hard-heartedness. Like Pharaoh, this master's profits come from the hard work of others. So, is this parable really about the kingdom of heaven? I'm not so sure. Some say that it follows on from that bridesmaid story which begins, "The kingdom of heaven is like." But others say that Jesus has taken a break here from talking about how the kingdom will be to comment on how this world is now. That is, his world, in the towns of the Galilee and the city of Jerusalem in the first century under Roman occupation. Maybe this parable is his critique of the world as it is, a world where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. If this is the case, it would seem more likely that the master that Jesus is talking about does not represent God, but rather a member of the unjust elite class. And the first two slaves, loyal and enterprising, represent those who keep the system going by imitating the unjust behavior of the master. Jesus often spoke out against the unjust accumulation of wealth. After all, he told us to refuse all storing up of treasures, what he calls building bigger barns. And he says you can't serve God and money. So, where is God in this reading anyway? Maybe Jesus is to be found in that third slave, the one who opted out of the exploitative system by burying his coin in the ground. Jesus, whom Paul says did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave. Now, this errant slave ends up cast into the outer darkness, which, if we're paying attention, is precisely where Jesus tends to spend his time, with those cast out of society. In fact, in the parable that follows next week, the one about the sheep and the goats, it is precisely in and among and through those very outcasts, the poor, the hungry, the sick, that Jesus says we will encounter him. Just as this parable ends in outer darkness with the third slave condemned to suffering, so too will Jesus be condemned in the very next chapter of Matthew's gospel. And just like that third slave's coin, Jesus will be buried in a tomb. As we know, that's not the end of the story, ultimately. But it is the end of this story. It's less than satisfying, isn't it? Sometimes Jesus' parables leave us with more questions than answers. So here we are, imperfect people in an incomplete world. I wonder, what are we waiting for? As we gaze out at our world in all its incompleteness, maybe we find ourselves longing for courage to speak truth to power, for wisdom to share and steward our resources justly, for compassion, to act to bring an end to cycles of oppression and violence, or for inspiration, to take part in bringing the reign of God a little closer now. Or, as we gaze inward at all of our incompleteness, we may find ourselves yearning for assurance at a deep inner level that our worth in God's eyes cannot be measured in weights or numbers. We long to know that the kingdom of heaven is within us. These are all hard things to wait for on our own. It helps to have a community. This is our purpose, to learn and grow together in our truest identity. In the words of Franciscan theologian Richard Rohr, you are inherently, objectively, totally, and forever a child of God. You cannot gain or lose that by any achievement or any failure whatsoever. God doesn't participate in the honor-shame system. Christianity's single role is always to tell you that you are a child of God by whatever words, symbols, relationships, or sacraments it can muster. In our gathering here this morning, in our singing, in our listening, in the silence, in the breaking of bread, and in the prayers, may we be blessed with a taste of the kingdom of heaven in the here and now, within us and among us, a treasure hidden in a field, held and cherished, known and loved. Thanks be to God.